Remnant will return. Hello, everybody. This is Gilgamesh, and we're going to embark on our next part of chapter 10 of Isaiah in our ongoing series discussing the book of Isaiah. In this series, we go through the entire book of Isaiah and discuss it in detail, every verse, all of it. And so this is a fun part here. I have mentioned in the last section that chapter 10 actually has 5 different poems in it, including one on each end that flows off to the other side. This is the third such poem in this chapter and encompasses verses 20 through 27. Previously, we did 5 through 19, and we're going to do the rest in the future, but that's the plan here. This poem changes perspective from what we have been talking about in the last poem. The last poem was all about the invader. It was around the king of Assyria who had been acting terrible and doing terrible things to people throughout the countryside. He thought that he did all of this by his own power and did not acknowledge where his power came from. And as a result, he was compared to a large, beautiful tree that gets chopped down and maybe set on fire. And his people were compared to a forest, which will then be mostly mowed down until there are just only a few trees left. We're now going to change perspective entirely. And I mentioned before, there's not always complete agreement as to where these poems break up. The idea of chapters is a much later concept. And exactly where the chapters end, as we're going to see here, even where some of the verses end and the next one starts, can be a matter of dispute, and sometimes it's uncertain. But I mentioned also that sometimes it is quite clear. And this is one of those examples here where we have a clear transitional phrase here. As we look at verse 20, it says, "And it shall come to pass in that day." There's your transitional phrase. The "and it shall come to pass" tells us that we are, first of all, talking about a future tense here. So he's seeing into the future with this phrase. And also the "in that day." These are just transitional words to say, okay, here's a new thought. And it's important to dissociate this a little bit with what he just was talking about, because now we've entered into something new, and we're going to see it's a completely different perspective. This one is all about the remnant returning. It says here in verse 20, "And it shall come to pass in that day, the remnant of Israel and the refugees of the house of Jacob will no more lean on him who struck them, but will lean on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, in truth." This idea that they will lean no more on the person who struck them, this seems to clearly be related back to the previous section that we had back all the way back in chapter 9, where the Lord chastises them for not turning to the one who struck them. Now, there it was the Lord doing the striking, and it was a little bit different metaphor. The Lord had struck them, but they would not turn to him. And so his hand was still outstretched and his anger wasn't turned away. And that was the refrain we had throughout that poem. Here it's saying that they have been leaning on the person who struck them. And it's not the Lord, it's the temporal power here, this invader, this oppressor, that they will no longer lean on him, but that they will turn to the Holy One of Israel and lean on him in truth. And so we've switched metaphors around here quite a bit. And the Lord is saying that they should not be leaning on this foreign power who is striking them, because he does not have their interests at heart. It's not entirely clear who the foreign power is. It could be Assyria or it could be Egypt. The two are somewhat intermixed in this poem because it's styling Assyria as sort of the new Egypt. And so throughout this poem, Assyria and Egypt are kind of combined into one entity to just represent this idea of a foreign power. Egypt, the one of the past that had oppressed them, and Assyria being the one of the future who will oppress them. And so when we talk about this, it's hard to say exactly which one it was, because we do know that the Israelites made an alliance with Egypt, which was in its 25th dynasty right now, which were actually a set of Nubians that were ruling Egypt at the time. And they tried to team up with Egypt to stand against Assyria, a very logical move to try and survive in a very difficult circumstance. But Isaiah has been opposed to relying on foreign powers because he believes they should be able to rely on the Lord. And it's saying here that they're no longer going to lean on him who struck them, which could be a clear reference to Egypt that they were trying to form an alliance with, but they will lean on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. And then we have verse 21, which is another one where you have to pay very close attention to what's being said here to understand the references to other parts of Isaiah. It's a very important verse here. It says, a remnant will return, the remnant of Jacob, to the mighty God. This is all about the four wonderful children, or at least two specific ones. When it starts here with a remnant will return, the Hebrew word is She'er Yashuv, which was the name of Isaiah's oldest son and the first of the four wonderful children that shows up in the text. It's saying here specifically the name of his son, and this is the only time that he uses those exact words together here. A remnant will return, She'er Yashuv. And then he refers to them as the remnant of Jacob. And who are they going to return to? They're going to return to El Gibor, the mighty God. This is the only other place in the entire Hebrew Bible where that title is used. It was used for the fourth wonderful child, part of whose name was the mighty God. And here, the exact same phrase, El Gibor, is used, the mighty God. Those are the only two places where those show up. It is an obvious connection to his prophecy through these children who he said were for signs and wonders. And so this idea that a remnant is going to come back and they are going to go back to El Gibor clearly ties into two of those wonderful children that he put forward as signs. And so this verse has to be understood in that context. And it's a very nice rhythmic verse. You can't see it in the translation as much, but what we have here is She'er Yashuv, She'er Yaakov, El Gibor. Now, I hope you can hear it there. We have these repeated phrases. She'er, remnant. Yashuv shall return, She'er, remnant. Yaakov, Jacob. Then we have El Gibor. The preposition to is the word El. The word for God is El, pronounced exactly the same way. And so he's getting this very rhythmic thing that you can't see as easily in the English, but that's what's happening. It's very rhythmic, very interesting verse. Then it goes to the promise of the Abrahamic covenant. For though your people Israel be as the sand of the sea, only a remnant of them will return. And here he has again those words, She'er Yashuv, clearly tying it into this powerful prophecy. And so he brings it back to the promise to Abraham that his seed would be as the sands of the sea, but only a small remnant of them are going to actually be able to come back from this. Then he says, destruction is decreed, overflowing with righteousness. Doesn't sound good. For the master, Lord of hosts, will make a full end, as decreed in the midst of all the earth. This wording for making an end is the same word that we had back in verse 18, where it was said that both soul and flesh would come to an end through this scourge sickness that he would send among them. This seems to be, again, a reference back to that, thematically connecting these 2 poems. Even though they are, I think, 2 separate poems, it is quite common for him to connect them via themes. He's saying here that he's going to make an end as was decreed. Therefore, thus saith the Master, Lord of hosts. And he keeps using this title here, Lord of hosts, which is his military title, Lord of armies. O my people who dwell in Zion, be not afraid of the Assyrians when he strikes with the rod and lift up his staff against you in the way of the Egyptians. Again, a thematic connection here, the idea that the Assyrian is lifting up his rod. If you recall the last poem, that it talked about that the Assyrian was a rod who thought it could lift up its wielder. And this is a direct connection back to that he is a tool that thinks that he is the one in charge. Do not be afraid of him when he tries to lift up the rod against you. And then he uses this phrase, in the way of the Egyptians, a clear reference back to where they were beaten under Egyptian captivity. And so Assyria is the new Egypt. He is the new Pharaoh of the Exodus here, with his arrogance and his pride that has to be brought down. For in a very little while, fury will end, and my anger will all be spent. We again have this verb here of coming to an end, making an end. referring to the previous verse there where an end has been decreed. And here, the end that's happening is an end to the anger and the fury, the punishment. The punishment is not something that will last forever. It will come to an end. It has an end. And so he's saying that after just a little while, the punishment time will have passed. The anger will be spent. Now, by anger will be spent, I need to talk about this one a little bit because it's a problem. You'll see some translations that say, my anger will be directed to their destruction. It's just a guess. The verse here is corrupted in such a way that we can't really tell what it's saying. It has what's called a hapax legomenon, which is a word that occurs only one time, and we have no idea what it means. What we think happened here, though, is when you use old texts, spacing was a bit more of an art than a science. And we think that the spacing got messed up. And so there is the way it is written traditionally, which does not say anything that is known. But if you were to rearrange the spaces a little bit, you can come with the translation, my anger will all be spent. And the reason why we think this is the correct translation is because that puts it in a nice parallel with fury will end. Now, you'll also notice that some translations have my fury will end, and mine doesn't. And that's because the Hebrew doesn't actually have the word my on that word today. But we also think that it might have previously. There's some textual indication that we lost a very small letter called a yod at the end there that would make it my fury. But it would parallel better if it was my fury. But the idea here that Hebrew uses parallels is actually a very important thing for us to be able to preserve translation and to be able to make accurate emendations to the text, is we know that this line should sound something like the line before it. And by changing the spaces around, we go from a word where we really don't know what it means and we were just making guesses to something that seems to fit the line above it a bit better. And so that's a very satisfying thing. And I think that's probably the correct thing to do with the text here. So, for in a very little while, fury will end and my anger will all be spent. Then we have verse 26 here, a nice little A-B parallelism. When the Lord of hosts will wield against him a whip, as when he struck Midian at the rock of Oreb, and his staff will be over the sea, and he will lift it in the way of the Egyptians. So nice A-B parallel here, where we have whip and staff parallel to each other, and then we have the battle of Midian and the reference to the Egyptians, two historical references on the B parts. We again have this reference to Gideon and his battle at Midian and the rock of Oreb. This one seems very fitting in its place here. It has a nice parallel to the reference to Egypt and the Exodus. You'll find in Judges chapter 7, verse 25, that the Ephraimites executed the Midianite general Oreb at a rock, which was subsequently named after him. They killed him there, and he got the rock named after him. Verses 24 and 26 here both end in the exact same phrase, in the way of the Egyptians. And they're used very differently. The one is talking about using a staff, and it's being wielded by the bad guy, the king of Assyria, who is wielding it in the way of the Egyptians. And this next refrain here is a staff being wielded probably by the Lord himself, if not possibly by a prophet, but definitely by a good guy, who is going to wield it over the sea in the way of the Egyptians. And so a different reference to the staff, the one being the staff of the smiter, the taskmasters of Egypt, and the other being the staff of Moses that parted the Red Sea. So he's saying, don't be afraid of the Assyrians when they beat you like the Egyptians did, because I've got a staff too, and it also works. And both of them, it references to them as in the way of the Egyptians. While the king of Assyria is being cast as a second pharaoh of the Exodus, there is also going to be a second Exodus. And the idea that the remnant will return is often paralleled to the coming out of Egypt, that it's going to happen again. That just like they came back out of Egypt, they're going to come back from these oppressors in Mesopotamia. And then we conclude this poem with verse 27, and it will come to pass in that day. We have here a return to our opening, and it will come to pass in that day. His burden will depart off your shoulder, and his yoke from your neck he will destroy. And so the idea here is that this is just the summation that you will have freedom again. And we have this envelope structure where we end the poem as we began it. You see this a lot in the Psalms, where you have an envelope structure where the final verse sort of reflects the first verse. And it ends it very simply with saying that the burden will come off your shoulder. Another metaphor with the children of Israel being placed like beasts of burden that would be put to work under a yoke, like oxen generally are what are put under a yoke to pull a heavy load or to plow a field, etc. That they will have that yoke taken off their shoulder, a common symbol in the scriptures for freedom. I do have to talk about the way this verse ends. Many translations will have another third line on here, and they won't have the he will destroy on the end of the second line. The problem is this verse is also corrupted. And the last three words, we know all three words, but they don't make any sense. The Hebrew literally says, he will destroy a yoke before oil. And we've worked a lot to try and make some sense out of that and come up with some crazy things. King James Version did like a free word association and said oil, maybe anointing, and maybe we can tie this into a Messiah figure somehow. That was a bit of a stretch. Every time it mentions oil, that does not necessarily mean the Messiah or any kind of messianic anointing. In fact, the word for oil and the word for fat are the same word. King James went with because of the anointing. That still isn't what it's saying here. It says literally a yoke before oil. The idea that he will destroy being tied to these words, some people have come up with crazy ideas like maybe we're going to get so fat that the yoke won't fit on us anymore, or that the yoke breaks. Again, absurdity, trying to make sense out of something that clearly does not make sense. So what can you do with it? Well, one possibility is that the word for destroy belongs to the line before it, which is what I did in my translation. And his yoke from your neck he will destroy. That does involve changing a letter called a vav to a yod, and a yod kind of looks like a short vav. And so that's not a radical change. Those kind of mistakes happen a lot. And then that would make it work nicely for there. Then the next word we have to look at here is the word for yoke. We just had the word yoke when it said that his yoke from your neck. Now we have the word yoke again, but maybe that was a mistake. The word yoke is a two-letter word in Hebrew. There's other two-letter words that are spelled the same way that it could be instead of the word yoke. The other possibility is if it lost a final hey on the end, it could be the verb Allah, which is to go up. In Hebrew, you use particularly the verb to go up when you come towards Jerusalem. You always go up to Jerusalem regardless of what direction you're coming from. You always go up to the mountain of the Lord. You use this verb Allah, to go up, to ascend. And so if we put a hey on the end there, it could mean he will go up. He will go up before oil. Still doesn't make any sense. So we have to look at it some more here. The part before oil, mipnei shemen, people have tried to correct this in a lot of ways. One way they've tried to correct it is some have read it as from before Ramon, meaning that they try and put an extra R sound in there and make a proper name out of it. He will come up before Ramon, one possibility. The other one, put an R sound in a different spot there and come up with Shomron, which is the word for Samaria. He will come up before Samaria. These are all a little speculative. And the third one, the one that seems to be the one that Robert Alter likes, and I think I'm the most convinced by, is to put an extra yod sound in there and come up with Yishmon, which is a word for desert. He will come up from the desert. That, I think, is the best way to understand these last words. So to take the verb destroy and put it with a line before it. So this poem would end with, and his yoke from your neck he will destroy. And then these last three words are not part of this poem or this verse. They actually belong to the next verse and say, he will come up from the desert. And we're going to leave it there to find out who the he is and what he's doing coming up from the desert, because it's a completely different poem and a different thing. But yes, we think that these three words probably don't belong to this verse, and there's been a missing letter or two for them to truly make sense. And we think that this verse should end with saying, and it will come to pass in that day, his burden will depart from your shoulder, and his yoke from your neck he will destroy. And that's where this poem should end. And we'll come up with those three next words on our next segment. Hope to see you then. Please like, subscribe, do all those things. I'm not making any money off this. I just like to know that somebody enjoys it. So hit the like button. It makes me feel better. Anyway, see you next time and have fun.